So you want to make 3D games in a 2D engine. It's a bold move, it's a brave move, but it can be done, and I'll show you how. Today we're going to be looking at some 3D collisions in Construct, using nothing but some clever math. No plugins, no external code, just pure Construct3. Here's how you do it. Starting off with a brand new project, we're going to create a 3D shape and then give each face a shade of grey. This is purely visual and you don't have to do that if you don't want to. Also, I like to give the back face a distinct colour so it stands out in the event sheet. Finally, add a colour to this cube so it pops. This is going to be the collision cube. This is what the player collides with. Now I'm going to create a second cube, which is going to be our player. Now if we go into our project settings by clicking on our layout and pressing view at the bottom left, we can see our Z-axis scale is set to normalized. Normalized is a range from 0 to 1 and it uses relative depth rather than actual pixel units. For this I want to be using regular because width and height are measured in pixels and I want the Z to be measured in pixels too. Finally I'm going to create a floor by copying one of our collision cubes, changing its size to be over the whole layout, changing its Z elevation to be a bit lower and adding a grid pattern on it with a tiled background. Now it's time for some code, so we're going to add in the 3D camera, our keyboard and the mouse. Now that's it for the setup. So what we've done so far is we've created our collision cube, we've made one big collision cube underneath the player for the floor, we've created the player, and we've added in the keyboard, the mouse and the 3D camera. Back over to the event sheet, we're going to be adding a new script that says start of layout, set the camera parallel to the layout. This is going to initialize where our camera is going to be. And for the coordinates, we're going to be using the player's X and Y, and then the player's Z elevation plus their Z height minus 2. This is because we want the camera to be at the top of the player, but not at the very top, not on their head, more like eye level, so a little bit down. And then for the angle, we use the player's angle. Secondly, I'm going to add the event set field of view. This is so that the field of view is set at the start of the layout and you can give options to the player to change the field of view. Now if you go to the player object and uncheck initial visibility and run the layout, you can see the camera starts where the player is. So we've done the setup, we now have a first person camera. But now we're going to need controls for this camera, so I'm going to set up the mouse movement. The first thing we need is going to be a variable for mouse sensitivity. I'm going to set this to 0.08 as we're going to multiply any mouse movements by this. But really you can use any number here, just play around with it until it feels good. The second thing we need is a script that says on movement for mouse. That way it detects any movement from the player. And the event for this is going to be on movement rotate camera. So it's going to detect mouse X and Y movement and rotate the camera accordingly. So what we want here is our mouse movement X multiplied by the sensitivity and same for the Y. The two angles at the bottom limit how much you can look up and down, so you just leave those alone. Now when we launch our layout, we can actually look around. For the next thing, we're going to add a quick script that locks the mouse to the screen. Construct already has a setting for this, you just do request pointer lock. Now I'm going to do some movement, so we're going to create a new group and call it movement. Inside that we're going to do W, A, S and D movement. I'm going to set up some basic movement, but we're going to have to redo it later. So first we're going to set up a variable for player speed, that way we can change how fast the player moves. And I'm going to make that a local variable by dragging it into the group, that way I can change it in the same place as I'm changing the code. Now for the movement script, we're going to use move at angle and move by the speed times delta time. Now if you don't know what delta time is, I'll probably cover it in another video, but for now just know that you need to multiply your speed by it. Otherwise at higher and lower frame rates the game will run differently. For the angle use 3D camera.x rotation. Then for forwards we just use the x rotation. For going right we plus 90, for going backwards we plus 180, and for going left we plus 270. Lastly we're going to put in this script which just tells the camera to update to the player's position. Now when we load in, the mouse should be locked to the screen, we should be able to move around with WASD, and the camera should be able to move with the mouse. So we're nearly done setting up the first person controller. What we need now is gravity. And in order to make gravity work, we need to be able to stand on the platform. So first we're going to work on collisions. For the ease of math, we're going to add 3 instance variables to both the collision cube and the player. This is the Z top, middle and bottom. Also we're going to add a variable on the player called grounded. Here's the scripts we need for the collision cube and the player. Essentially we're setting the top, middle and bottom to the top, middle and bottom. The top of the object is the Z elevation of the object plus its Z height. The bottom is simply its Z elevation, and the middle is Z elevation plus half of its height. Also, we're setting the players grounded to 0 since we want to check if they're on the floor every frame. Now, Construct doesn't have a native way to check for 3D collisions. After all, it's a 2D engine, so you can only check whether objects are overlapping. However, by checking the top and bottom of an object against one another, you can see whether they would be colliding. In the example shown here, the cubes flash red when their relative positions on the y-axis are about the same. This checks for the top and the bottom of the object, and when they're red, this would mean they are essentially overlapping on the y. Now if we do the same thing for the z, we can check whether 2 3-dimensional objects would be overlapping. Then if we just check whether they're overlapping on the x and y as well, which Construct can do natively, we can essentially do 3D collisions. What this all means is if we can take the top, middle and bottom of a cube, we can find whether it's overlapping something on the z-axis. This can mean we can check for ceilings and floors. This function here checks to see if the bottom of the player is less than the top of the collision cube, and then the top of the player is greater than the bottom of the collision cube. If that's the case, then the 2 objects are overlapping on the Z. Then we want to check which one has the highest mid. So if the Z mid for the player is greater than the Z mid for the collision cube, it's going to return 1. But if the collision cube has a higher Z mid, it's going to return 2. That way we know whether the player is colliding from above or below. That informs us whether we're hitting the floor or hitting a ceiling, which will allow us to change how the player moves along the Z. For this, we're going to add a new variable to the player called Z-force. Then we're going to put in this rather chunky script. What it does is it checks each collision cube based on the distance from the player. You do distance and then brackets player x, player y, collision cube x, collision cube y. This means it will check the closest collision cube first and go outwards. Later in the script we use the stop loop action, which means that once it finds a cube which the player is colliding with, we don't need to check any more. That way we don't check every cube in the whole layout, and that helps with optimization. So first we check if the collision cube is overlapping the player. Remember, this is only on the x and y coordinate, so that means the player is currently touching the cube in terms of a 2D perspective. Then it sets the Z collision to the function.collisionCheck and in brackets 0. This 0 is the Y offset. We don't need to worry about that right now. Essentially what this asks is the player overlapping any collision cube on the Z and on the X and Y, which would mean you're inside the cube. If the collision is 1, that means you're colliding from it from the top, and if the collision is 2, you're colliding from the bottom. Essentially the top being on top of the platform and the bottom being hitting your head on the bottom of it. The script then says if the player is on top of the collision cube, set grounded to 1, and set the Z elevation to the collision cube top -1. This means you'll be slightly inside the floor. Not that you'd notice, but it means you won't be above it, so that way when we're doing more collision checks, you won't immediately start falling. The script then says if the player is below the floor and colliding with it, it will set the Z-force to 0, and the Z elevation to the collision cube's bottom minus your current height -2. The reason we do -2 is so the camera doesn't accidentally clip inside the block. Okay, now we have that script in, we're going to create a new script that says when you press space, if you're grounded, set the Z-force to 200. Remember, positive forces mean you're going up, negative forces mean you're going down. Now we need to create a new global variable called gravity, and then make our physics script. So this script's going to say when grounded is 0, or you're not on the ground, subtract gravity times delta time from your Z-force. This means every frame your downwards momentum will increase, just like gravity does. Then it's going to say if you're on the ground and your Z-force is negative, i.e. you're moving down, set the Z-force to 0. This is when you hit the ground, you want to stop going down. Then every tick, you're going to set the Z elevation to the player's current Z elevation plus Z-force times delta time. This will mean that it will apply the momentum from the Z-force to the player every frame. Now if you place a collision cube above the player and load into the project, you should be able to jump around and hit the bottom and tops of blocks. You should be able to jump on top of them and platform between them. Here I'm messing with the gravity and the Z force for the jump, which will make the jump higher and also fall faster. Now if you try and walk into an object, you will clip beneath it, because essentially the object will detect that you're trying to be inside it and also below it, so it will force you out. This is because our movement script doesn't take into account where the cubes are. As I said earlier, we're going to have to edit the movement script to handle collisions along the X and the Y. Since we already have the Z collisions, we know which objects we should be colliding with. So the last thing we need is this custom action for the player. We're going to call it move, and essentially this is a custom version of the move at angle script. Now it's going to be very similar to our Z collision script, since we want to make sure that the player is colliding along the Z as well as the X and Y. Otherwise when you walk beneath an object, since you're technically on top of it or underneath it in the X and Y, you would be colliding with it. This script is very similar to the top and bottom collision. First feature the collision cubes based on the distance, we're checking if we're overlapping it. This means you're going to be colliding with it along the X and the Y. Then we're going to do compare two values, and the first value is our function.collision check with a -1 on the Z offset. Now the reason we do -1 is so that it's offset by 1 downwards. That means if you're standing directly on the floor, you're not going to be colliding with it because it has to be at least 1 unit on you or above you. And we want to check if this function returns as anything other than 0, so we do not equal to 0. This means if the collision's a 1 or a 2, it will consider it to be colliding with the player. That way we know whether the player is inside it and overlapping along the X and the Y. So this script moves you at the angle and distance which you plug into it, and then if you are colliding along the X, Y and Z, it will move you back that same distance. This is a very simple way of doing it. Essentially what it says is if you move forward and now you're inside something, move you back. That's all it's doing. And this isn't the best way to do collisions because it doesn't account for the fact that you could slide along walls and things. So basically if you move even slightly into a wall, it'll move you back and stop you from moving, which doesn't feel great. But for this purpose, it's perfectly fine. So we just want to update all our movement scripts to use this new custom action move. Same angle, same distance. And there we go. We now have 3D collisions on your player character. You can now have a platforming game where you run around jumping on cubes, hitting the walls and everything. The only thing is, I would say, maybe try and get a better collision script, but honestly it works fine for a starter game. Next time I want to be looking at how to do mesh collisions, which is to say you grab a sprite and offset mesh points to create kind of a mountain range, and it creates this really nice 3D environment you can walk around in. As always though, check the description, you can download the project, check out the code, it's all commented down there. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you want to see more, and join the Discord if you want help with your projects. I'm always around to give people a hand. So have fun with your 3D stuff within Construct, and we'll see you next time.